And he will separate them one from another, as the shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He will place the sheep on his right and the goats on his left. Then the king will say to those on his right, "Come, you who are blessed by the Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. A stranger, and you welcomed me. Naked, and you clothed me. Ill, and you cared for me. In prison, and you visited me." And then the righteous will say, "When did we see you? And when did we do all of these things?" If you were listening closely, you could hear Christ enumerating what we are expected to do. How do we live in the circle? How do we live giving ourselves to God, to our neighbor, and to ourselves? So, one of the very first thing that Jesus says in this particular part of the gospel is we're to feed the hungry. Then he says, give drink to the thirsty. If there's a group here, I would have you tell me what they are. Clothe the naked. Clothe the naked. Shelter the homeless. Visit the sick. And visit the imprisoned. And bury the dead. So as we look at these are all actions that we are expected to do with our neighbor. When we see our neighbor hungry, we're to feed them. When we see them thirsty, or naked, or without shelter. When they're ill, we visit them. When they're imprisoned, we visit them. And we bury the dead. How many times do we really think about what this means? Usually we think about, oh, these are the things you do when you are going to be confirmed, and they're what we ask young people to do. They have to get out there and they have to do the corporal works of mercy. Yeah, that's true, but it refers to every single one of us. There should not be a day or a week goes by that one of these has not been done by you, by all of you. It's not something that we leave only to those people out there, but it's our way of fulfilling the great commandment. How do you love God, love your neighbor, as well as yourself? We are not talking about social service here. We're talking about looking at our neighbor, finding them in need, seeing the image of Christ there. And we do it because of Christ. It's not because, oh yeah, I should do this, I have to do my social outreach. No. This is not a social outreach. We're not talking about that. We're talking about how do we recognize Christ in the people around us. And I think so many times we don't. We don't even think of Christ in the people that we meet. We see a lot of homeless people and we'll say, well, if they ever got their act together, then they wouldn't be homeless. Or we see somebody that didn't pay their rent. They say, well, if you would have paid their rent, they wouldn't be without shelter now. So we have all of the ways of saying that if they would have only done thus and so. Now, with the war going on right at this point, and Poland receiving a lot of refugees, they're being called upon here to do a lot among the Corporal Works of Mercy. But we can't think of it only those people because of war have been pushed out of their country. We see them every single day. We see them with the people in your own family. Have you ever thought of just your family members alone? How many times are any of these things done with your family? Okay, now, those are the corporal works of mercy. I'm going to go back a little bit later, and we're going to talk about specifics, some specifics that you might not have thought about. But I want to get down our spiritual works. These were our corporal. And now we're going to talk about the spiritual. These we may not recognize as much because we don't have Christ including them within the sermon that he was giving about separating the sheep from the goats. But you will find every single one of the spiritual works of mercy in Scripture. Christ is referring to it at some place in Scripture. And the first one is to admonish the sinner. And you may be thinking, oh yeah, I'm going to tell somebody else that they need to be better when I'm not better. We're going to talk about that a little bit later also. Well, first you're going to get them all on. First, to admonish the sinner. Then, to instruct. To instruct the ignorant. Then rise to counsel. Counsel the doubtful. Look right here. Counsel the doubtful. This, still missing something, isn't it? C-O-U-N-C-I-L. C-O-U-N-C-I-L. Bear wrongs patiently. This is a biggie. Bear wrongs patiently. Forgive others. And then finally, or shouldn't say finally, comfort the afflicted. And then pray for the living and the dead. If you notice on each one of these, there are 7, and there's 7 for a specific reason. In usually within Scripture, whenever we hear 7 or some concept of 7, we're talking about a fullness of something. That God made the world in 7 days. You'll find references to 7 all over. And so here we see 7 spiritual and corporal works of mercy. Now, Pope Francis has added an 8th one. And we're going to be talking about that in a little bit. But right now, I want to go back now and look a little more in detail at let's start over here with the Corporal Works of Mercy. We know that everybody needs food for their well-being. And it's an act of love to help others obtain their food. Those of you that bring food for the food bank, those of you that go and work in places that feed the hungry, all of those are ways that you are showing this corporal work of mercy. You may not have ever thought about it that way. But basically, it also starts at home. You family members, parents, you need to see to the proper nutrition of your loved ones, whether it's your children or your elderly parents. That also comes under feeding the hungry. We've talked about giving support for food drives, for food pantries, all of those agencies and services that feed the hungry. Another way is for us to avoid wasting food. Again, I think in our country we throw away tons of food a day, and yet we know that around the world, or even within our own country, there are people that are lacking food. Do we ever think of sharing our meals with others? Ever thought about sending cookies to college member from your parish that's away at college? Ever think about doing that? That would come into here. Taking food to families that have just lost a loved one, or who are in need, or who have somebody's in the hospital. One of the things, as you know, that we do at St. Mark's is assemble holiday food baskets. That's another way. Pack care packages for service persons or for kids at college. Or even share a snack with somebody that forgot their lunch. All of those are ways of feeding the hungry. But what we do here, how do we give drink to the thirsty? Watch for ways to save water. And as I was coming or driving around today to various homes, I was aware of so many roads that are underwater, that they were busily trying to get the road able, or the drains able to take more water. You ever thought about handing out bottles of water at a race or at something that's going on? Or did you ever think of helping somebody who is thirsting for the presence of a friend? It's a different kind of thirst, but it's very real. Or do you ever think of passing out bottles of water to the homeless? Or taking a full glass of water? Or by clothing the naked. How many times do you go through your dressers and your closets and look at all of the things in good condition that you really don't need anymore? It'd be a good thing to do twice a year, in the spring of the year and in the fall of the year. Because there probably are many people who need something. Volunteer to work at a clothing drive. Or buy socks and underwear for homeless persons. I know, I would imagine that it happens here also at the diocese, probably have programs of visitation for the imprisoned. One of the things that they ask for persons in prisons are socks. And you may think, well, why do they run through so many pairs of socks? Because they use it on their arms. They cut off the foot, because for many of them it's very cold, and so they cut off the feet and use it as an inner sleeve. Most people probably have never even thought about that. Or you look at the baby clothes in your closet that you don't need anymore, and you give it to somebody who's having a new baby. And again, St. Mark's does do the parish giving tree. So there's so many ways that we have of clothing the naked. Okay, how do we shelter the homeless? Say, well, I can't open my house to take in people. Maybe not. But have you ever had a garage sale with your furnishings in that could make money for somebody who is moving in that doesn't have, or that needs funds to be able to buy something? Another way of sheltering the homeless or welcoming the stranger, however you want to look at that, is to welcome parishioners at Mass. And I think that's one way that we can actually do an awful lot in this area. How many times have you heard parishioners say, or people say, well, I went to that church, but nobody even said hello to me? It's another way of welcoming the stranger. Do we ever welcome new families as they come into our neighborhoods? I think in today's world, very few people know who their neighbors are, because kids no longer play outside, and that usually was the way that families got to know who was in their neighborhood. Have you ever helped build a house for Habitat for Humanity? Many times they're asking for volunteers to help with that. Have you ever let your house be a welcome center for children in grade school whose parents are working and they have no place to go after school? Do you ever think of having them come over to your house, one or two? So there's an awfully lot of things, again, that we can do for clothing the naked. Visiting the sick, or I should say the shelter. Visiting the sick. It used to be that whenever anybody ended up in the hospital in the neighborhood, the whole neighborhood knew about it. Or the whole parish knew about it. And we're not so good at that anymore. So how do we become more aware of what's happening within the people of our parish, within our community? Have you ever volunteered at a hospital? Many times they have a number of ways to volunteer. And I think with COVID kind of winding down, there might be more opportunities to be able to do that. Have you ever thought of sitting with somebody that's home so that the caregiver can get out of the house and do something? You never think about that. You ever thought about playing board games with elderly at senior housings? Or to read to children that are in the hospital? Or volunteer to drive patients or persons for medical appointments? Or cook and deliver meals? Again, for the sick. How do we visit the imprisoned? Again, I don't know what programs the diocese has here for that, but usually there are a number of people that have training to be able to go into prisons and to visit the persons there. But if we can't get into the prison itself, what do we do with the families of the prisoners? Perhaps it's a wage-earning family member that's in prison. How do we help the family that's at home, the remainder of the family that's at home? Do we ever pray for inmates? Do we ever help when prisoners come out of prisons and go to halfway houses? Do we donate bus cards so that they have a way of getting from the halfway house to a place of possible employment? Do we send phone cards? Or have we helped somebody who's imprisoned by a handicap, a disability, that keeps them out of working or being with other persons? And then, burying the dead. It's very important to be faithful about attending wakes and visitation for families. You may think, well, there'll be plenty of other people there, I don't have to go. But that's one way that you can help bury the dead. Or participate in a bereavement ministry. Or spend time with widows and widowers. Offer prayers. Send mass cards. Call the cemetery and see if they need any help in the spring. Cleaning everything up is another way. We mentioned this before about making a meal for grieving families. Visit a cemetery and pray for the dead. You don't even have to visit one, but to pray for the dead. That's part of burying the dead. All right, those are some ideas for the corporal works of mercy. Now what about the spiritual works of mercy? I should mention that, as you probably noticed, the corporal works of mercy have to do with the body person, the body of the person. The spiritual works of mercy have to do with the soul, this very soul, the non-tangible part. How do we admonish sinners? And as I mentioned at the beginning, you might think, oh yeah, who am I to say that? Oh yeah, you shouldn't be doing that. What about your children? Are there times when you need to say, that is not a good thing to do, that is not right? Or if we see somebody that's beginning to do something, say, you know, you may want to think about that. I don't think that that's really what you want to do. So there are ways of admonishing the sinner. Instructing the ignorant. I think every family has a great responsibility here. Because who are the ignorant? Your children. Ignorant in the faith. Ignorant in so many of the types of things that they need to know in today's world. It doesn't mean necessarily going on being a teacher, a formal teacher in a classroom, but it does mean how do you bring your faith to your family, to extended family, to people that you know. Counsel the doubtful. How many times do persons say, I just wish I could talk to somebody? They don't necessarily want a whole lot of advice, but they do want somebody to listen. So one of the best ways of counseling the doubtful is to be available to them, be a listening ear. And at times you can say, well, have you ever tried doing this? Have you ever thought about doing that? Bearing wrongs. Oh my gracious. That is a biggie for everyone. How do we bear wrongs when we think we've been wronged? Do we go out and tell everybody, you know what they did, you know what they said, you know, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da? Or do we just let it be? The truth will come out. But it's very hard to do that. We don't bear wrongs patiently. There was a young saint, and right now I can't remember who it was. I remember it was Dominic Savio or some. Anyway, in the classroom where he was, there was another child who was really doing some things they shouldn't be doing in the classroom. But this soon-to-be saint was accused of it, and he took the punishment. And when they found out later that he was not the one that did it, they said, why did you do that? Why did you take the punishment? And he said, because Jesus did. And so if he can do it, why couldn't I? Now he's what you call a saint today. Forgive others willingly. Willingly. Usually, we always say, well, you know, on my deathbed, I might forgive. We forget that Jesus has said, you will be forgiven as you forgive. If you don't forgive, how do you expect God to forgive you? And people can hold on to areas that need to be forgiven forever. I remember talking to somebody one time, and I said, well, why do you still hang on to that? Why don't you let it be? Why don't you forgive? And they said, on my deathbed, I might. And I said, well, it would behoove you to do it way before your deathbed, or on your deathbed it won't happen. Remember, we're talking about a spiritual work of mercy, something that helps us to live within the circle. Comfort the afflicted. We know that when people are ill, we want to be there for them, or when they're afflicted in any number of ways. But comforting persons. It seems like anymore we're not so good at comforting. We don't even recognize when somebody needs comforting. And then pray for the living and the dead. All of us can use that. All of us living can use it. All of the dead can use it. And if you notice on these, the seventh one on both, one is burying the dead and one is praying for the living and the dead. And these two are very important, particularly when you look at the day that at the time when Christ was living, because it was a great offense against God not to bury the dead. And I often wonder in today's world, when people are cremated and they keep the ashes on their windowsill, or they sprinkle them over the river, the lake, the mountaintop, whatever, are they burying the dead? And so I would just ask us to take a look at that and say, okay, what are we really doing with our dead? All right, we got a pretty lot to do in that circle. If we're studying how to stay within, this is what we do. This is what, as Christian Catholics, we do. This is how we serve others. This is how we serve those in need. Not as a social service, but as one that's seeing the face of Christ. And I'd like to go back and just read the last part of Matthew's Gospel that we were just reading, that talked about the corporal works of mercy. If you remember when Jesus said, that people are saying, well, when did we see you thirsty or hungry or without shelter? When did we see you? And he said, well, when you did it for the least of my brethren, you did it for me. But now, look where this danger zone becomes very, very close to us. Then he will say to those on the left, depart from me, accursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me no food. I was thirsty, you gave me no drink. I was a stranger, and you didn't welcome me. I was naked, and you didn't clothe me. I was in prison, you didn't visit me. I was ill, and you didn't visit me. And they'll say, well, when did we see you? When did we see you with all of that? And Jesus said, if you didn't do it to the least of my brethren, you didn't do it for me. So we see how extremely important the spiritual and corporal works of mercy are. Because they're the ways that we live our commandment to love God, to love our neighbor, and to love ourselves. Now, Pope Francis added an 8th beatitude, or an 8th corporal work of mercy. And you might have remembered when he did that, it was after he had given the encyclical talking about all of creation. And for Pope Francis, he wanted to add care of creation to both the spiritual and the corporal works of mercy. And for the spiritual works of mercy, he asked us that we have a grateful contemplation of God's world, which allows us to discover in things a teaching which God wants to hand on to us, so as to see the beauty of God's creation. And the corporal work of mercy said it requires simple daily gestures which break with the logic of violence, exploitation, and selfishness, and makes itself felt in every way that we strive to build a better world. How do we take care of creation? How do we praise God for creation? How do we care for creation? And so he's added an eighth beatitude, or corporal work of mercy for each one. All right. Now we need to go on to the 8 Beatitudes. You think, isn't this enough? We've got 14, 15, 16 already. Corporal and spiritual works of mercy. Well, very quickly, we're going to talk a little bit about the 8 Beatitudes, very quickly. And I'm sure you've all heard them. You may not remember them as being called Beatitudes, but they are. Because Beatitudes are those that are blessed. You're blessed when you do this. Or we may look at them and think, oh yeah, but they use language that I don't even know what it means. And so it starts out with, blessed are the poor in spirit, the kingdom of heaven is theirs. Now, Christ is not endorsing physical poverty. But what he is saying, that we need to know our place and our need for God. That's where the poor in spirit. And that's why he can end up by saying, the kingdom of heaven is theirs. Because we've come to acknowledge our need of God. The second are the blessed are the meek, they shall possess the land. You may be thinking, oh, I don't want to be meek. Not me. Oh no. Well, usually when we're talking about the weak, we're meek, not the weak, the meek, we're talking about strength under control. Where is our greatest strength? And most of it is understanding God's authority in our lives. How do we live with it? Do we live with it? How do we recognize that God is any part? Because he said, blessed are the meek, those who willingly understand that ultimately everything belongs to God and is under God's authority. The next are, blessed are they who mourn, for they shall be comforted. You say, well, why would you be blessed if you're mourning? Well, let's look at the types of things you mourn. Perhaps the condition of the world as it is today. Everything that's not in right relationship with God is things to be known. The loss of a loved one. There are so many ways to mourn. And what he's saying, blessed are you who mourn over these things, for you will be comforted. You will find a place. Blessed are they that hunger and thirst after justice. What do we mean by justice? It means to stand in right relationship with each other. How do we stand in right relationship with God? Do we ever think about how our actions, what we say, what we do, how that affects our relationship with God? That's hunger and justice, or hunger and thirsting after justice. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy, or in other words, forgive. Blessed are those who forgive, for you shall be forgiven. And we've already said a little bit about that. Do we receive God's mercy? We ask for it all the time, but do we give others mercy? Blessed are the clean of heart, for they shall see God. What do we mean by the clean of heart? It's being able to see God in all the beauty, splendor, and holiness that is his. And where we meet God in our everyday life, And I think so many times we look at this one and say, blessed are the clean of heart. We don't really know what that means. And so we just kind of pass it by. But it's how do we open ourselves up to an encounter with God? We all run into God many times a day. And if I asked any of you, where did you meet God today? You'd say, I don't think I met him anywhere. Well, that's too bad because God met you in a number of different places. So how do we make ourselves alert to the presence of God in our lives? That's what it means to be clean of heart. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called children of God. We need peacemakers today. We need peacemakers within families, between nations, within nations. It seems like we find war or discord in so many places. And so no wonder Jesus would say, blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called children of God. And blessed are they who suffer persecution for justice' sake. Oh, persecution. Oh no, I'm not going to, that one, leave me out of that one. Well, let me ask you, how many of you stand up to defend the teachings of the church when you're faced with possible ridicule? Not too many people. You won't talk, or you won't say anything, because you're afraid of the scorn and ridicule of other persons. The people that have met death threats, or have been called names for the belief that you have in God, in Jesus, in the church. And in today's world, there's an awfully lot of scorn and ridicule if you stand for what you truly believe your faith says. It's not an easy place today, but it's a perfect way for martyrdom. You say, yeah, but not me. Who says? You may not give your life as far as shedding your blood, but you may give your life as far as standing up for what you believe. But I think more and more we're seeing people saying, oh, no. No, I agree with you. I don't believe that part of it anyway. Do we really? We need to really look at the Beatitudes because they all tell us about our relationship with God. And I don't think we can afford not to recognize that relationship. And it's becoming more and more important to be able to relish that relationship and be willing to talk about it when the time comes. I know, I remember as a child, we're talking about relationships or forgiveness. And I remember I had a sister that I loved to fight with. Yes. And my mom always knew that I started the fights, but I always denied that I started the fights. And she said, Barbara, when are you ever going to turn the other cheek? Okay, I'll try that. And so one time something happened, and I got hit by my sister. And I turned the other cheek, and she hit me again. I thought, no, you're not supposed to do that. I turned the other cheek. That's the sign you don't hit me again. Oh, was I furious. I said, it didn't work. However you got that, it didn't work. It's taken me a long time to figure out what that meant. It does work. Kind of to wrap things up, I'm hoping that out of this, you came to understand how you stay within the circle, what you do in the circle. And the Beatitudes, I had no more room in the circle, but the Beatitudes are how do we grow towards God in our relationship with God. The Beatitudes really tell us about that. And they're not something that, they never made much sense. I'm not going to think about them anymore. No, they're kind of the overlay of all of this. Because if indeed you know who God is, you know who you are in relationship with God, then you will know how to live the spiritual and corporal works of mercy. It's that simple. No, it isn't. This is not a simple thing at all. Christ didn't come here to teach us how to be simple, although his teachings are simple. But we make them very, very complicated, and then we dismiss them because they're too hard. I would like to close with a very short prayer. Oh my God, fill my soul with holy joy, courage and strength to serve you. Enkindle your love in me, and then walk with me along the next stretch of road before me. I do not see very far ahead, but when I have arrived where the horizon now closes down, a new prospect will open before me, and I shall meet it with peace. Amen.